What's up, everybody? This is Christoforou from the Duran, and I have with me Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst via Moscow. And today we're going to be talking about the Idlib Agreement. All right, Mark, thanks for joining us here on what was a busy week of news in Syria.
Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the Duran, Alex.
Great. It's great to have you, and I'm sure you're going to shed a lot of light as to what happened. Not so much, we can get into a little bit of the dotting of the IL-20, but a lot has been said, and there's a lot of talk about who did what and what happened there. But I want to focus on the other side of the news that didn't get as much attention, but warrants a lot of attention. And that was the agreement between Russia and Turkey, specifically creating the 15 to 20 kilometer DMZ in Idlib, avoiding what many say was going to be a very, very big conflict, in Idlib. And supposedly Putin and Erdogan have avoided that for now by creating this DMZ. Before we get into the debating about the deal, if it was good or bad and all these intricacies, give us some details as to what was agreed upon between Putin and Erdogan.
Yeah, okay, so this memorandum, and that's what they're calling it, comes on the heels of a very unsuccessful Astana format meeting between the presidents of Russia, Turkey, and Iran in Tehran, where because it was actually filmed live, the disagreements between Putin and Rouhani on one hand and Erdogan on the other, specifically over Idlib, became quite public. And I think it was the first time that people really saw behind the smiling faces and diplo speak that has characterized this dangerous geopolitical waltz that is the Astana format. Between Russia, Iran, and Syria on one hand, and Turkey and their jihadi proxies that they represent at that table on the other. No deal was reached in Astana, and then a bilateral agreement between Putin and Erdogan was quickly arranged, and the details of this, the meeting was on Monday, and the details were announced immediately. And basically what the deal is it is a postponement of the offensive, possibly leading into a frozen conflict scenario in a bad case scenario. It gives Turkey more time, gives Erdogan more time, in theory, to do what he should have done, according to the Astana previous agreements, for the last year. And the primary thing there involved is to separate the good jihadis from the bad jihadis, which he has shown no inclination to do. Initially, the details of the memorandum weren't made public, but in a few days after that, they were released online, and the full text is available. It's a very sparse memorandum. There is 10 points. It takes up the entirety of about a half of a page of a document, which does not bode well, because that means there's no specifics, and there's an enormous amount of wiggle room and holes in this. So what it basically does is declare another ceasefire. It postpones the Syrian government's offensive to liberate Idlib from the Turkish-backed Al-Qaeda and friends. And it puts forward a path that Lavrov has said is only the first step in freeing Idlib. It's only a first step in reunifying the country, but it's not clear where things go from here. Now, according to the agreement, a 12 to 15 kilometer wide demilitarized zone will be created between the Syrian government and between the jihadis, Turkey's jihadi proxies, the quote rebels unquote, in Idlib. Within this demilitarized zone, radical forces, terrorists, which are not specified in the document, and there is no agreement between Turkey, Russia, or any other player in this scenario exactly who or who isn't a radical or a terrorist group, which has been the problem all along. They are supposed to withdraw from this demilitarized zone. And they've been spending the last year plus fortifying themselves, entrenching. They've got underground tunnels and bunkers, concrete hardened, ammunition, food supplies. They're stocked all along the front lines of Idlib. And they've been reinforced in the last 2 weeks by a huge influx of arms, tanks, heavy artillery, grads, missiles, etc. from Turkey. So they are armed to the teeth. They are well supplied, and they are well fortified, entrenched in position. They are supposed to, the radicals among them are supposed to withdraw from this DMZ, and they are supposed to take their heavy weapons with them. They're supposed to do this by October 10th. Turkey, Erdogan, the one who backs and supplies them, is supposedly responsible for making sure that they do this. There is no indication of how he intends to go about this, and we're already well into a week. You know, the days until October 10th are ticking by rapidly, and there's no sign that the Turkish regime is doing anything but sending more of its own troops to Idlib. Erdogan, as part of the initial Astana agreement that created the destabilization zones, created 12 observation posts. Consider them small Turkish military bases all around the perimeter, the inside perimeter of Idlib in Syria. He's been reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing those, again, with concrete, with air defense, with tanks, with artillery, and more troops. And he just announced this week that he'll be sending more troops. So there's already thousands of Turkish troops in fortified positions around Idlib on the front lines. They have not confronted militarily any of the jihadi groups there. In fact, the Western mainstream media has reported on multiple occasions that these observation posts were set up with the agreement and with an escort by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which everyone agrees is Al-Qaeda. I mean, not associated with Al-Qaeda, not linked with Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda.
Even Turkey.
Just 2 weeks ago, Turkey, for the first time, admitted that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a terrorist group, but of course they haven't done anything about it. And since then, they have sent their convoys supplying arms and this influx of troops to the Idlib front lines to prevent the Syrian army offensive. And again, Al Jazeera reports that even after Turkey recognized them as a terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, provided security escorts for the Turkish convoys to bring the arms and troops to the Idlib front line. So once again, Turkey has never indicated they have ever intention of military confronting Al-Qaeda or any of the other associated jihadist groups in Idlib or anywhere else in Syria. And in fact, they do everything to cooperate with them. They pay their salaries, at least there's Western analysts agree that 70%, this is the number, of Idlib is controlled directly by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Al-Qaeda.
Okay.
And that includes the choke point main transportation route for supplies from Turkey, the main passage over the Turkish border, by which They routinely tax 50% of all supplies and arms that go into their own coffers. Everyone knows this happens. It's the unofficial payment for Al-Qaeda. This is how they get their money and arms. And they also control the capital of the province, Idlib city, along with the other 70%. Now, a good portion of the other percent is controlled by their firm allies, which contain the Turkestan Islamic Party, which we talked about with the Chinese Uyghurs and so on, and several thousand hardcore jihadis from the Chechens and others from the Caucasus in Russia. And between Russia and the Georgia and the other provinces there, and as well from Central Asia. And these are battle-hardened, hardcore Wahhabist jihadis. And they know how to fight, and they know how to use heavy military equipment that Turkey has provided them with.
Now, just to clarify for our viewers as well, Mark, so you can explain things and break it down. As they're referred to, HTS is how they're referred to. They're short, right? HTS, and they're Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Okay.
President Putin has been referring to them as al-Nusra,
okay, which
was the previous name in the Syrian conflict before they once again rebranded themselves and got a few new allies. They continually, some groups drop out, some groups join up, and basically every time they do, they try to rebrand themselves. But even the United States has stated that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is Al-Qaeda. There's no question about that. And the way the Western media for the last few weeks, as they try to present what's going on in Idlib as some kind of heroic rebel defense, referring to a territory that 70% is controlled by Al-Qaeda and everyone else operates under its umbrella, its suzerainty, as rebels. I mean, did rebels take down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11? I mean, is that how we should refer to Al-Qaeda operations in other countries now? Now, the other biggest group in Idlib is a direct Turkish proxy group. They're in Turkish uniforms. They're called the National Liberation Front. And right now, they mostly consist of Ahrar al-Sham, which is an Al-Qaeda splinter group, hardcore jihadis. Previously, they might still be financially backed by Saudi Arabia. And they have spent much of the last 6 years trying to come up with deals to officially remerge with Al-Qaeda. One of the other major groups is Al-Zinki. They're famous jihadist group that was directly and openly backed by the United States, and they're the ones who infamously filmed themselves because they thought it was good propaganda, I guess, sawing off the head of a young Syrian boy.
Right.
So that's the kind of groups, the moderate. So
listening to you, you've identified pretty clearly the groups that are in Idlib.
Yes.
What is stopping Turkey from basically getting HTS out of there to begin with, getting the radical jihadis, like you said in the opening segment, getting the radical jihadis out of Idlib? Because it seems to me that they can be identified. Correct me if I'm wrong. They can be identified. The powers that are involved, from Turkey to the U.S. to Russia, know who these people are. Syria, they know who they are, and they can get them out. What's stopping Turkey from doing it? And why is the U.S., if this is Al-Qaeda, the eternal great enemy of the United States, the enemy that we've had the war on terror on for 16, 17, 18 years, why is the U.S. not siding with Russia, getting involved with the Syrian government, so that we can eradicate Al-Qaeda from Idlib, who you obviously are noting that they are there. They're entrenched there. We can get these guys. What's going on here?
Okay, well, they are there, and they can be identified. But the problem, as it has been since the very beginning of the Syrian conflict, is because they are the dominant military force among the opposition. But you can't separate them. The other rebels, if Al-Qaeda disappeared, would be done within a month. Less time than that.
Okay.
And they refuse, the moderate rebels refuse to turn against Al-Qaeda. From the very beginning, even the political groups, the shadow governments, the national council outside of Syria, the puppet government in waiting that the U.S. set up from the very beginning of the conflict, back in early 2012, refused to recognize then called al-Nusra, what would become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, refused to say they were terrorists. They refused to separate themselves. And every peace agreement in the country, from the Geneva protocols, for solving the conflict, from the Kerry-Lavrov agreement, everything all the way through to the Astana agreement, and now onto this, has always collapsed. All the destabilization alone have collapsed because the moderate rebels refuse to separate themselves from Al-Qaeda and the other jihadis, which is why no country will identify, none of the countries that back the rebels will identify specifically which groups are terrorists, because they're all allied with Al-Qaeda. They have fought amongst themselves. They fight all the time, right? That has been a characteristic of the conflict. They fight for rent. They fight for control of territories, the income that comes with it. They fight for transit points. They fight for who's on top. Very little ideological or doctrinal differences, right? But they all fight the Syrian government, the military, and the other groups. They all fight together. And this is the same thing in Idlib. They refuse to separate. They refuse, they say if they're attacked, we're all attacked. And Al-Qaeda leads the rebel defense, 70% of Idlib against the Syrian government attempting to retake their own territory. Turkey knows this. Turkey supplies the rebels arms, salaries. Recently, in the last few weeks, with the collapse of the Turkish lira, there has been an open, mainstream media press reported bit of disgruntlement from Turkey's proxies in Syria. They protest against being paid their salaries in the Turkish lira because the value of it is dropping. They have informed Erdogan, these Syrian rebels, that they want to be paid their salaries by the Turkish government in the Syrian pound, which is a more stable currency. That is how Orwellian.
Unbelievable.
Both the U.S. and Turkey. The reason they don't turn against Al-Qaeda in Syria is very simple, is because here, as with the managing of the conflict with ISIS before, when the U.S. would attack ISIS in Iraq, or when they threatened its Kurdish proxies, and actually provided close air support when it attacked the Syrian government. They're managing the conflict. It's using Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and these other groups against the Syrian government. And, that's been admitted, very, very openly by both Kerry and Obama as they were leaving office. They outright said, that they were laying back off of ISIS, and they've never really fought Al-Qaeda there. And if you're paying any attention to the news, you're well aware that the groups that the U.S. was backing in their attack and eventual destruction, as it were, of Libya, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, were also linked with Al-Qaeda. And if you take a look at Yemen, Saudi's invasion of Yemen, which the U.S. is openly and actively military supporting, they're making deals again with Al-Qaeda on the ground. Al-Qaeda is on the Saudi and the U.S. side in Yemen, and the invasion of Yemen there. So you see this repeated again. Oh, they'll fight them in Afghanistan. They'll fight them, in other places. But in other countries where it's to their geopolitical benefit, they will very cynically support them. The U.S. has said, quite openly, David Ignatius reported a few weeks ago in the Washington Post, an anonymous Trump administration official, our biggest goal in Syria now is to create quagmires for Russia and the Syrian government. That is to make them bleed, right? Their own, another Afghanistan, or, their own Vietnam, until we get what we want, which means a political regime change, what they couldn't win by taking Damascus on the ground. And that is the cynical type of calculation that is going on here. because the U.S. in the last 2 weeks announced that it would, instead of pulling all of its troops out of Syria, as Trump repeatedly said he wanted to do, he campaigned on it, he said it was once in his office, we need to get our boys out of there. The smart thing, in the last 2 weeks, the United States has announced an indefinite, that is permanent, U.S. military presence in Syria. This is all across East Syria. And the fact that the U.S. announced they're staying in, they're not leaving out, that added strength to Turkey's position. Now, they don't like the U.S. backing the Kurds, but they see that once again, the U.S. is becoming more focused on getting rid of the Syrian government just by different means this time. And now it's the partition of Syria. Syria will never be a unified. Everyone says they support Syrian territorial integrity, but they mean only if the government we have is in charge of the entire country. Until then, the country is partitioned. And this brings us to this, quite bullshit deal here that I'm afraid is going to create a frozen conflict. Turkey is not going to do anything to disarm or the militants within this DMZ area that is supposedly going to be patrolled by Turkish and Russian troops. I don't see that ever happening. And, they are not going to get them to withdraw heavy weapons. And that October 10th deadline is kicking. And what that means is that come October 10th, Russia is going to have to make a decision. Are they going to give Turkey a third or fourth reprieve? Does this become a frozen conflict? Does this, in effect, become, Idlib, along with the already directly Turkish-controlled Jarablus corridor next door? Does this become the new northern Cyprus, except ruled by jihadi proxies, under the control of Turkey? The best case scenario, this is what everyone is actually hoping for, is that officially Al-Qaeda and these other groups disband and then put on Turkish proxy uniforms and cosplay as the Syrian opposition in Turkish uniforms. That's actually what the Russian government is hoping for, that Erdogan gets them under his direct control, continues to rule Idlib through them. No one's talking about any withdrawal of the opposition from Idlib. That's not even in the agreements. In fact, the agreement specifies that attacks on Idlib will be avoided and the existing status quo will be maintained. That is Turkish control by proxies, by jihadi proxies of Idlib. That is directly what they're talking there. And this is, where it's going. Russia's job in this is supposed to be to prevent the Syrian government from liberating their own territory. They're supposed to be preventing an offensive there. And since this last failed Astana agreement, we have seen multiple attacks outside. Now, this isn't just Idlib concern. There is also parts of Latakia province, parts of Homs, and parts of western Aleppo that connect onto the Turkish proxy-controlled territory in Idlib. And we have seen attacks on Latakia city. We have seen attacks on outside, just outside of Idlib, in the about the southwest, a Christian village called Marzeh that was attacked, and many people, including children, were killed. And even since this new memorandum came in this week, there was an attack just before recording last night by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, launching missiles into Aleppo proper. So already Turkey is supposed to stop Al-Qaeda from launching attacks outside of Idlib, and they're already not fulfilling that, which is why Idlib is a threat. They are a threat because they are raising the next generation of Syrian and whatever other Uyghur and other jihadi children to be the next Al-Qaeda. Even Vice News has done reports on how Al-Qaeda is raising the next generation of Syrian youth as terrorists. They continually attack raid outside the region whenever they get the strength to do so. And they have attacked the Russian military bases, both with mortar attacks when they get close enough and with drones. And how Al-Qaeda is getting, fairly sophisticated and regular fleets of drones to launch attacks. I doubt that they're buying them over, eBay or Amazon. Yeah.
So why is Russia signing this devil's deal? Why are they putting their name to this agreement, Mark? It sounds to me, I was looking at this conflict and thinking Turkey has the short end of the stick. God has Erdogan painted himself in a corner. Russia, Syria, Iran, they have all the cards here. Why then does it seem to me, after listening to you, does it seem that in this agreement, Turkey got everything they wanted?
Yeah. If you read, the Western experts on Syria that have been supporting this all along, they're cautious, but they definitely say that Erdogan won this one, that it's a success for Turkey over Russia. And the reason is that Russia is desperate to avoid conflict, open military conflict with Turkey, because that is what it would entail. When a deal failed to be reached at the Astana Agreement and the offensive was being prepared, Turkey sent not only arms, but its own troops into Idlib, making it clear that if an offensive was launched, it would mean war with Turkey. At the same time, the U.S. is openly backing Turkey on this now, at least, despite the other problems they may be having with the Kurds and with the arms supplies. The U.S. was saying openly, that if there was a chemical weapon attack, right, we know who will be responsible for it, and we will attack. That's, the presumed being arranged chemical weapon hoax. But they also made clear that even if they couldn't arrange one, even if there wasn't a chemical weapon attack, if there wasn't an offensive, on Idlib, they would strike anyway. So this would mean we're back to open war, a new escalation of the conflict, the proxies not having succeeded. And if Russia and Syria try to clear the board of the last bit of them, then it would mean open war with Turkey, the U.S., and probably Israel as well in the south. And it's unfortunately it's simply a conflict that Russia can't win. Their expeditionary force in Syria is small, and they could easily be cut off at the Dardanelles, airspace, and otherwise, and chewed to pieces. The Turks have a very large military on paper. It's been purged in the last few years. They've got problems. But, at the end of the day, quantity in the theater would tell. And it would be a very bad position. So Putin really, unfortunately, has no plan B. And he actually insisted earlier that Turkey fulfill their initial Astana escalation zone agreement by putting up these observation posts, Turkish military bases in Idlib. Now he's really painted himself into a corner. They can't get Turkey out of Syria, not out of the Jarablus corridor, and now not out of Idlib. And I'm afraid that what this memorandum is doing is not only allowing Turkey to continue to build up and entrench their own military and their proxies in Idlib, but it's also making a further step of legitimizing the Turkish military presence in Syria as acceptable to Russia, acceptable to Iran, acceptable to Syria, whatever they may say in private. And this is bad. I mean, we're looking at a new northern Cyprus directly controlled by jihadis, and there is, under Turkish dominion, a kind of a neo-Ottoman arrangement. And there's no clear way now, short of open war with Turkey and possibly the United States and others, how Putin and Assad and Rouhani are going to get Turkey to get out of Syria. Turkey's got its own problems because they've backed the jihadis this entire war. they face a terrorist threat at home if they give up the support. And the FSA commanders, the Free Syrian armies that are left, now part of the National Liberation Front, made very clear that if Turkey gave up Idlib, then they would be in Turkey within 2 weeks, and they would be launching attacks within Turkey. And Turkey also has to deal with the refugee problem. We've seen all of the Islamists, the jihadis, their families. Jihadis have families too. Bust into Idlib, this entire conflict, an area that was already extremely Sunni religious conservative and very susceptible to the Al-Qaeda, jihadist Wahhabi message. Turkey already has some 3 million Syrian refugees in there, and the Turkish population, while generally supporting Erdogan's military measures in Syria, they want the Syrian refugees gone because they're taking their jobs. They're costing Turks and the Turkish government money. They don't want any more refugees. Their goal is to resettle Idlib and the Jarablus corridor with the refugees they've got in Turkey right now. And it is assumed that these would become de facto Turkish citizens. When you saw protests in the last week against the offensive by the Syrian government and Russia that was supposed to happen, you saw crowds of the jihadis, never of course any women, because that's the nature of Sharia rule in Idlib now under moderate rebel control. They were flying Turkish flags. They're chanting Erdogan's name. Erdogan, with this deal, has only cemented his popularity among these jihadis in Idlib. They see him now as their leader. Maybe a leader they don't always agree with, and they're a little bit cautious about. They're afraid that at some point he might feel the pressure to throw them under the bus. But not right now. And right now he's got renewed credibility with them. And it would damage his position at home, both security-wise and domestic politics with his, ultra-nationalist, religiously conservative base, if he stopped the support. So once again, Erdogan somehow has leveraged this and has all the cards now. And I'm afraid that come October 10th, when Turkey hasn't done anything, Al-Qaeda hasn't moved, hasn't even officially donned Turkish proxy uniforms. And let me say that having all the Wahhabis, jihadists, Islamists in Syria don Turkish proxy cosplay uniforms, that is not a solution to the Syrian conflict. You can't negotiate with people who want to impose Sharia law on Syria. That is not compatible with the secular, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic Syrian republic. So that's a no-go. And that would create effectively 2 governments, possibly 3 in Syria, an effective permanent partition, and a northern Cyprus on steroids. It's a really bad situation, and I don't know where we go from here. I expect Russia to very quietly see the October 10th deadline come and go and make noise, and nothing happened.
Yeah,
because it's a bad situation.
It's a situation I'm very well aware of for 40 plus years. What's happening? So to sum it up, Mark, real quick, I want you to look 10, 20, 30 years into the future, because to me, Turkey will not leave. They're raising a whole generation of Al-Qaeda jihadists. How is this going to blow back against Europe, the United States, and the West?
Well, the U.S. already has a failed, what are we going on now, 17-year military occupation of Afghanistan that is not going well for them. Things will continue to not go well for them in East Syria. It will continue to cost the U.S. taxpayers money. But I don't see geopolitically how they can come to accept having been beaten by Russia and Syria here. They will maintain that, whatever the cost in money, in troops' lives, and so on, until they get the political regime change in Damascus that they failed to get openly through their proxy war.
They will maintain Al-Qaeda. They will maintain Al-Qaeda.
Turkey will maintain Al-Qaeda. The U.S. will keep using the Kurds as proxies, despite the conflict between the two of them. I expect Turkey and the U.S. to eventually come to an accommodation. Turkey isn't going to be leaving NATO. I know Putin has dreams of creating whatever kind of wedge he can between Turkey and NATO. It's not going to happen long term. Unfortunately, the Turkish military is too entrenched, and Turkish interests are too much at a conflict with Russia and Syria. I don't see a good way out of this situation. Syria doesn't, in the near future, have a possibility, even within 10 years, of regaining all of their territory. I don't see, bar a big change of government in Turkey. That is the one thing that could possibly solve this situation. Possibly, depending on who came to power afterwards. But short of that, I see the partition of Syria, another frozen conflict. Russia seems to love managing conflicts with frozen conflicts. We see it in Ukraine. We see it in Georgia. We've seen it in Moldova and elsewhere. Rather than deal with the situation to the end, and I don't see any type of accommodation here. It's going to cost Syria. The U.S. is in control of, in the east, most of the oil supply. That's going to make rebuilding the country really hard. Again, unless the Syrian government gives up and removes Assad as president. And that would be very hard for the stability of the country right now, because he's the one who's seen them through the conflict this far. The problem is just the end game. The end game suddenly becomes very hard because it's all the low-hanging fruit that has been taken so far. And, the Turkish and the U.S., now in direct military occupation of Syria along with their proxies. That's what's going to be so hard to dislodge. And I don't see that Putin has a plan B.
All right. So, okay, we're running on almost 40 minutes, but real quick, I have to ask you, in your opinion, do you think that Russia should have proceeded, Russia, Syria, Iran, all the forces should have proceeded to liberate Idlib? Yes. Yes.
I think they should have done everything possible to avoid hitting Turkish troops. They should have avoided the observation posts. But they should have made clear that they had the moral, the international legal right, everything to go after Al-Qaeda and their allies. 2, 3 UN Security Council resolutions that say that Al-Qaeda and every individual organization and dagger associated with them and their safe havens must be eradicated. That is what multiple UN Security Council resolutions had. Their best bet was making the Turkish government back down. They're in a tough place economically. They're in a tough place politically with the U.S. They've got a problem with the U.S. backing the Kurds in the east. Putin should have put pressure on Erdogan to back down, and he couldn't make it, or was unwilling to risk making it happen. And that is, I'm afraid, going to result in the permanent Turkish occupation via the proxies of Idlib, as well as the Jarablus corridor, effectively most of the northern Turkish-Syrian border for the foreseeable future.
And Al-Qaeda will remain intact within those borders.
An Al-Qaeda statelet that is a threat to Russia, is a threat to the region, and is a threat to the whole world.
Exactly. Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst via Moscow. Thank you very much for a fantastic conversation on Idlib in Syria, and your insight was incredible. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. In the description down below, you'll see links to our PayPal and Patreon page. Mark Sleboda, International Affairs Security Analyst out of Moscow. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Duran.
All right, until next time, take care.